Ghost story, like a fine wine, improves with age, and for anyone that sets out in search of things that go bump in the night, tracking down the very best specimens can become a fascinating preoccupation. What's more, a ghostly tradition is attached to the imposing castles, deserted battlefields, historic houses and coaching inns that Great Britain is famous for, with the nation's inhabitants quick to retell ghost stories that have incited a delicious state of terror for generations. Often, the would-be ghost hunter will start a search in one direction, chasing a specific apparition, and end up heading on a completely different course as other spectral beings materialise. Equally difficult to predict is an individual's susceptibility to the supernatural. Some people can walk into a room and in an instant recognise a spiritual presence, whilst others can live for years in houses that are reputedly overrun with ghosts and never experience a single out-of-the-ordinary event. Also, there are many different categories of ghost, ranging from the headless horseman to the malevolent and invisible poltergeist. There are animal ghosts, ladies in white, ladies in grey, hooded monks, screaming skulls, abandoned children, even royalty, with kings, queens, princes and a variety of notorious celebrities. Undoubtedly, a dark, tapestried room, or a cold, barren landscape where the wind howls mercilessly will add to the ambience, and the great country houses that have remained almost untouched for centuries are an ideal place to start. Graveyards are another favourite location, having an added chilling dimension, with the more ancient often boasting a church grim. The first person to be buried in a graveyard is said to be responsible for guarding it from the devil. As this was a seemingly immense task, and the relatives and friends of the poor unfortunate soul were usually horrified at such a prospect, a completely black dog would be buried in a new graveyard before any human remains were deposited. This is why many of the stories of graveyard ghosts include the phantom form of a large, fierce black dog. In parts of Europe, the Anku, or graveyard watcher, was a human victim, buried alive to become the graveyard's ghostly guardian. The traditional explanation for involuntary shivers as someone walking on your grave is thought to originate from the presence of the different spiritual forms charged with the protection of the dead. Even today, there are few brave enough to walk through a graveyard after darkness falls, and such places are frequently the inspiration for the great horror films that thrill modern audiences everywhere. Ghostly make-believe may well have an important part to play in the immortality of the ghost story, but fact is nearly always stranger than fiction, as the following ghostly trails will substantiate. The wild moorland countryside of Yorkshire is chillingly beautiful, and thanks to numerous film adaptations, few can fail to conjure up the image of a dark, ghostly Heathcliff scaling rock and dale to meet the spirit of his long-lost love, Cathy, in this truly dramatic setting. Heathcliff and Catherine are of course fictional characters from Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. It was a shocking novel in its day, and the reading public found it difficult to accept that the creator of this terrible tale was the respectable daughter of a country clergyman. However, for the many who visited the parsonage at Haworth, where Emily lived with her famous literary sisters Charlotte and Anne, there was a strange sense of foreboding that concealed a real-life drama of equal magnitude and terror as the classic novel itself. When the Brontë family moved to Haworth Parsonage in 1820, there were 8 of them. The Reverend Patrick Brontë, his wife Maria, 5 daughters and 1 son, Branwell. Although a promotion and a much larger house, tragedy struck swiftly. Within 5 years, Mrs. Brontë had died of cancer, and the 2 elder daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, had also died, rapidly following their mother to the family vault in the Church of St. Michael and All Angels. It was a terrible blow for Patrick. Left alone, with 4 small children, and the bond that developed between the surviving young Brontes was a strong one. They spent hours together, out on the moors, creating wild stories of the faraway lands that they'd read about, writing and illustrating their tales in tiny little books that their short-sighted father was unable to read. Growing up in a house that overlooked the church and graveyard, death was never far from the children's thoughts, but nobody at that time realised that it was the situation of the graveyard at the top of the hill that was contributing to the terribly high death rate in Haworth. Unfortunately, all of the water for the town flowed through the graveyard, and the more people they buried one on top of the other under flat gravestones, the more contaminated the water supply became. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were rife. But it was only after the Babbage Report of 1850 that the people of Haworth realised what was making their life expectancy considerably worse than those living in the London slums. The Brontë children would have seen neighbours buried on a weekly basis, with the tall grey memorials blighting their every waking moment, let alone their troubled dreams. Hardly surprising that they escaped to the beautiful open countryside at every possible opportunity. Despite its tragic memories, the Brontes loved their home, and for Emily, being removed from Haworth was unbearable. When Emily and Charlotte were away at school, Charlotte actually wrote home saying that she feared Emily would die of homesickness if she was not permitted to return. The family hopes were placed firmly upon the shoulders of Branwell, who set off for London with enough money to become a portrait painter. Coupled with the fact that Branwell was not actually very good at painting, he was also addicted to alcohol and opium, and the money was quickly squandered. He returned to Haworth in disgrace, and after other equally unsuccessful attempts to make a living, he remained at the parsonage, terrorising anyone who denied him the means to sustain his habit. Charlotte, Emily and Anne quickly realised that they would need to earn their own livings, and after unhappy attempts at teaching and being governesses, they turned to writing to make their fortunes. Charlotte was the most successful, with Jane Eyre in 1847, and in the same year Anne's Agnes Grey and Emily's Wuthering Heights were published. But all was far from well at the parsonage at the top of the hill. Branwell's health deteriorated, and he died of tuberculosis, aged 31, just a year later. Emily only lived a further 3 months, dying of the same disease at the age of 30. Anne survived, although also suffering from TB, until May 1849, dying during a visit to Scarborough with Charlotte. For Charlotte, although suffering the loss of all her siblings, life eventually began to improve. Further novels were published to great literary acclaim, and in 1854 she married her father's curate. Happiness was, however, short-lived, as Charlotte died, thought to be in the early stages of pregnancy, in 1851. The terrible fortunes of the Brontë family and the great popularity of the now famous novels has turned Haworth into a tourist attraction, with thousands walking the sloping cobbled streets from all over the world. As people stop for a drink at the Black Bull, Branwell's favourite watering hole, there are those who report seeing his slight, ghostly figure walking out through the door. His other main destination used to be the apothecary's shop for bottles of laudanum, the form of opium that he was addicted to. If Branwell's ghost walked into the shop today, now called the Rose Apothecary, he'd be surprised by how little has changed. The authentically recreated atmosphere is a joy, and although laudanum has long since disappeared from the well-stocked shelves, he'd undoubtedly find a good selection of natural hangover remedies. Much has been written about the Bronte sisters, but it's perhaps Emily that still remains the most elusive. She certainly went out of her way to preserve her anonymity. When Charlotte found and read Emily's poetry and suggested publication, Emily was furious and refused to even consider the idea. It took all of Anne's diplomatic skills and the submission of her own poems to placate Emily. Also, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey were published under male pseudonyms, and when Charlotte decided they should all go to London to reveal their identities to their publisher, Emily again went into a rage, refused to cooperate, and the other two sisters went alone. Ghostly ladies in Victorian dress are a common phenomenon, and the visitors that see a glimpse of a bonneted figure in the graveyard or through the streets of Haworth automatically feel that it's one of the famous sisters. Faces are often seen at the parsonage windows, with many convinced that they've seen a Bronte ghost, and the most likely candidate for any hauntings has to be Emily. Her fiery temper left no one in any doubt about her views on publicity when she was alive. So perhaps her spirit has returned to ensure that even in death her privacy is respected. There's been a recent development that may offer another somewhat more controversial explanation for the appearance of Emily Bronte's ghost. Author and criminologist James Tully has produced a book which accuses Charlotte Bronte of poisoning her brother and two sisters. Under the guidance of Arthur Bell Nichols, the curate she eventually married, Charlotte is alleged to have administered fatal doses of arsenic in Bramwell, Emily and Anne's food. Charlotte was thought to have been jealous of Emily's Wuthering Heights, and a possible motive for her killing was perhaps the suppression of a sequel. Charlotte's known to have destroyed her siblings' correspondence after their deaths, and who knows whether this included another wild, dark, ghostly manuscript from Emily's pen. What really went on behind the closed doors of Haworth Parsonage when the Bronte family were in residence will never be known for sure. And a dramatic setting such as this is bound to feed the active imagination. After all, the place and its location inspired Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte to write some of the finest and most eerily thought-provoking novels to be found anywhere in the world of literature. Cornwall is a land of myths, rich in the Celtic folklore of its ancestors. Whether stunning coastline, or further inland high on the wild moors, there's a wealth of legend and supernatural atmosphere for the ghost hunter to investigate. Stones and monuments are scattered in seemingly random fashion all over the county, but there is always a reason for their presence, though on occasion this will owe far more to the creative imaginations of ancient Cornishmen than it does to historical fact. And when the two become intermixed with the passage of time, the resulting ghost stories can be eerily convincing. This first port of call is King Doniet Stone, a memorial to an ancient ruler of Cornwall who wanted to ensure that his spirit would rest in peace. All that's left today are the carved bases that would have held wooden crosses with a Latin inscription that translates as "Doniet ordered this cross for the good of his soul." It also asks that prayers be said for him. King Doniet drowned in 875 AD, a death sudden and unexpected, with his subjects perhaps afraid that he'd return to haunt them. There's an unusual aura about this place, despite the busy road that it stands next to, and it's well worth stopping to take a closer look. One of the most mystifying stone circles in Cornwall can be found close by. Collectively known as the Hurlers, these gnarled grey slabs stand in one of the most barren, windswept stretches of the county. The most logical explanation is that they were, like Stonehenge, part of some ancient religious rite. But with no archaeological finds in the vicinity, there's no way of knowing for sure. But a local legend offers a far more romantic explanation. Hurling was an ancient game, something akin to modern-day rugby, and the people of this area were fanatical players. Rivals from nearby settlements often threw out challenges, and honour was battled for on this flat expanse of ground. One Sunday, when the priest and resident saint, St. Clear, found the church empty, he went off in search of his missing flock. He found them hurling against the men of St. Ive, and he demanded that they desist in their Sabbath-breaking forthwith. St. Clear was told, in no uncertain terms, that he could return to his praying if he wanted, but the two teams continued with a vengeance. Infuriated, St. Clear raised his staff and cried that if they preferred hurling to God, then they could stay where they stood forever, and with that he lowered his staff, instantly turning them all to stone. This, people say, explains the strange positions of the stones, and also the ghostly screaming and wailing that many claim to have heard out here when the spirits of the tragic men cry out to be released. Walk in any direction, away from the appropriately named hurlers, remnants of the once lucrative Cornish tin industry can be seen. Ruined wheelhouses and chimneys are silhouetted for miles, the only visible marker of the labyrinth of mine tunnels carved deep into the ground below. The mines of Cornwall are traditionally home to the ghostly knockers, fascinating and usually benevolent spirits that guide miners to the richest lodes. Mining in Cornwall called for a particularly tough breed. Not only did they need to be physically strong to successfully hack the precious minerals from the ground, they also had to withstand the psychological pressure of imminent disaster, with fatal accidents a regular feature of life underground. Miners were extremely superstitious. For example, The sight of a white rabbit or hare at the entrance to the mine was often thought to foretell danger, and no miner would ever make the sign of the cross underground for fear of upsetting the ghostly knockers. The knockers are unique to the mines of Cornwall, but other nations do have similar equivalents, but few are quite so helpful. Thought to be the spirits of Jews involved in the crucifixion of Christ, later sent as slaves by the Romans to work in the Cornish mines, the ghosts would knock on the walls to indicate where to dig. Miners who listened for them would hear the knocking get louder and louder until they found the exact spot where the riches lay. Factually, there were Jews that were brought as slaves to the mines with the Roman invasion, and even some Cornish place names reflect this. Morazian literally means the bitterness of Zion, and life for the slaves in the mines, whatever their religious beliefs, would have been bitter work indeed. Upsetting the knockers was a dangerous business. The story of one miner who failed to show them sufficient respect was used as a warning to others who scoffed at such ghostly nonsense. Tom Trevorrow was working a load of tin one day when the familiar sound of knocking disturbed him from his task. Instead of following, he became irritated by the noise and shouted back, "Go to blazes, or I'll scat your brains out!" He was answered by a shower of stones. Later, as he sat eating fuggan and smoking a pipe, the knockers disturbed him again, calling, "Tom Trevorrow, Tom Trevorrow, leave some of thy fuggan for knocker, or bad luck to thee tomorrow." Miners would always leave a portion of whatever they were eating whilst underground for the knockers. But Tom Trevorrow ignored the request, ate all of his food, and went to sleep. He awoke to find himself surrounded by the miserable, ugly little old men that he'd offended. Although only about 3 feet tall, they were a frightening collection, with bulging eyes and large hooked noses, and they poked at him with sharp, claw-like fingers. The knockers mocked and tormented him until they disappeared into curling smoke before his eyes. Next day, Tom Trevorrow was nearly killed when he was involved in an accident in the mine where he lost all his tools. When he eventually returned to work, the knockers constantly plagued him until he fled the area, never to be heard of again. A ghost story, whether ancient or modern, is usually connected to a specific incident. The idea that a person's spirit will not be able to pass to the great hereafter if they've left unfinished business on earth is as old as these rolling hills. Also, where death has come suddenly, without warning, or unjustly in a violent clash, ghost stories develop with predictable regularity. It therefore comes as no surprise to discover that many of the great British battlefields boast some of the most bizarre hauntings ever to have been recorded. Men died en masse, often the victims of incompetent leadership and personal greed, with the blood of thousands seeping into the ground where they fell, a futile memorial to a long-forgotten cause. One of the most famous haunted battlegrounds is Edgehill, strategically critical in the centre of England, close to that great Roman road, the Fossway, that is still a major route for the modern traveller. It was here that the first skirmishes in the civil war between the Roundheads, later to be led by Oliver Cromwell, and the Cavaliers of King Charles I took place in October 1642. A closer look at the facts behind the Battle of Edgehill and its well-documented paranormal events will take the ghost hunter on a fascinating journey covering a surprisingly large area. High up on the escarpment at the summit of Edgehill, there now stands the Castle Inn, complete with a spectacular octagonal tower. It was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Great Battle, on the very spot that Charles I raised his standard and called his men to arms. This programme is about ghosts rather than history, but a brief outline of what actually happened here all those years ago will certainly shed some light on the strange events that followed. The Royalist attack was led by Prince Rupert, the King's nephew, with a brilliant cavalry charge from the now peaceful village of Radway that left the Roundheads reeling. Victory seemed imminent, so the prince left his foot soldiers, took the cavalry to loot the enemy's baggage train. It was a tragic error of judgment. The Roundheads rallied, and the Royalist infantry suffered heavy losses. It's hard to put a precise figure on the casualties, but it's thought about 1,500 men were lost unnecessarily before Prince Rupert returned with the cavalry to prevent further annihilation. At the end of the day, honours were even, and the battle proved inconclusive. The Royalist standard-bearer, Sir Edmund Verney, showed immense courage when captured, refusing to give up the colours, defiantly shouting, "My life is my own, but my standard is the King's." He was slain, but when the Roundheads tried to take the standard, his grip was so firm that they had to hack off his hand. Sir Edmund's body was never recovered, but his severed hand was returned to his family home in Buckinghamshire, where it lies today in the family vault. The first signs that the terrible battle had left the area haunted came on the Christmas Eve of 1642, when a group of shepherds, countrymen and travellers on the road to nearby Kinnerton, where the Roundheads had been garrisoned, encountered a ghostly reenactment of the hostilities. The beating of a distant drum got progressively louder, and the noise of battle with guns firing, horses neighing, and men screaming made them convinced that they were in the midst of the skirmish. Then, out of nowhere, the two armies appeared in the skies above them, and the bloody fight continued to its horrific conclusion. Throughout, the men had been unable to move, but when the apparitions disappeared, they rushed to Kinnerton to tell their incredible story. It was, of course, the talk of the neighbourhood, and the following night many others joined them, including local dignitaries, at the place where the vision had appeared. And the same thing happened all over again, exactly as before. The whole story, including the continuation of these apparitions over the new year, appeared in a pamphlet published by Thomas Jackson entitled A Great Wonder in Heaven. The king, who was now encamped at nearby Oxford, sent his own officers to investigate the situation. When the men witnessed the eerie battle in the sky, they were able to recognise many of the ghosts, including Sir Edmund Verney, the brave-hearted standard-bearer. Although nobody was able to offer an explanation for the appearance of the phantom armies, local people began to wonder if there were bodies left unburied at some yet undiscovered location on the battlefield. When searches were made, their fears were proved correct, as the rotting remains of perhaps hundreds of men were found exactly as they'd fallen, littering a road that now boasts the gruesome title Blood Lane. Christian burial of the corpses seemed to quiet the restless spirits, and peace was thankfully restored to the area. This was not the end of the Edgehill ghosts, and there have been plenty of strange sightings since to satisfy the curious ghost hunter. From the village of Radway, there have been sporadic reports of ghostly soldiers on horseback lining the ridge up towards the Castle Inn and its distinctive tower. There is without doubt an unusual aura covering the entire area, perhaps accentuated by the occupation of the site by the Ministry of Defence, still maintaining a military stronghold. However, because of the great natural beauty of Edgehill, many come to walk its historic paths, and there are frequent reports of ghosts. Some people have been jostled and pushed as if in a crowd, others have seen the faces of long-dead soldiers, and there are of course a host of headless horsemen reported disappearing into the moonlight. Also there are gory tales of Sir Edmund Verney, blood dripping from his wrist, searching for the severed hand, still clinging relentlessly to the royal standard. Prince Rupert's remorseful ghost is said to make an anniversary gallop over the hill, and as King Charles allegedly stopped for breakfast in Radway after the battle, his ghost has often been seen on the stairs of the house in question. Perhaps the wounded were also taken to the village, as one cottage has a particular problem, with ghostly blood dripping through the ceiling to the floor beneath. An alarming phenomena that has been witnessed by successive owners. Edgehill does hold a fascinating place in history. Certainly amongst the associated ghost stories that have grown to legendary proportions, there are those that ring true with eerie precision. The outcome of the battle may have had little impact on the course of the Civil War, but the spirit of the age is forever preserved within this truly remarkable battleground. The village of St Briavels, nestling peacefully in the borderlands between England and Wales, is not the kind of place you'd expect to encounter an almost perfectly preserved ancient castle, complete with imposing gatehouse, towers and portcullis. What such a spectacular fortress is doing seemingly dropped into such a tranquil location is rather a mystery. However, further investigation will quickly reveal St Briavels' sometimes turbulent but always strategically important past. These days, St Briavels Castle is a very popular youth hostel, providing guests, young and old, with fine food, comfy beds, and a selection of ghost stories to thrill even the most sceptical high-tech teenager. Its origins stretch way back to the Norman conquest, when the French invaders encountered considerable resistance from the Welsh. It took over 100 years for Wales to finally submit to Norman rule, and William the Conqueror allowed his nobleman supporters, who had been granted lands within the borders, to run independent kingdoms. The territories were collectively known as the Welsh Marches, from as far north as Chester to Chepstow in the south. Marcher lords ruled their lands exactly as they wished, building castles, raising taxes, establishing towns, making laws, and waging war on their neighbours if they so chose, without any intervention from the king. This was one such castle, and there's still a king's seat carved high up in one of the stone walls, where the royal personage would sit when he came to visit, trying to maintain some sense of authority over his often wild and lawless subjects. Although the castle was often frequented by royalty, as time moved on through the changing ages, the occupants were far more interested in their own agenda than the bigger political picture. It was an armoury, and also a prison for the area, where justice would be administered and sentence passed. This room is covered in the graffiti of prisoners dating back to the 17th century. The clearest example actually says, "Robin Belcher, the time has come when thou shalt answer for it, for thou hast sworn against me. My dais is ruined, 'tis time I was gone, for I've been a great space, and I grow weary of the place." Ironically, this prison room, although full of atmosphere, is not the location for the most frequently felt ghostly presences within the castle. Another room, where a huge fireplace dominates, has on a number of occasions sent occupants searching for a crying child. One hostel warden in recent years was quietly working in the room when suddenly she heard the wails of a crying baby. Thinking that guests must have arrived, she walked down to the entrance, only to find the door closed and the castle deserted. She returned to her work, but could still hear the baby crying, which was extremely distressing, as she had searched everywhere for the source of the cries. Further investigation uncovered an incident when part of the stonework over the window had fallen away. When repairs had been attempted, the skeleton of a baby was found bricked up within the walls. A gruesome discovery, but sadly not an uncommon one in ancient buildings. The tragic result of a secret liaison might well end up disposed of in this manner if building work was underway, and there are stories attached to a few great houses where mother, child and lover have all been bricked up and left to die by a vengeful husband. This landing has also been frequented by a ghost on more than one occasion. The description is always the same. The most recent encounter with the castle's Grey Lady is unusual insofar as the gentleman she appeared to was a most unlikely candidate for a supernatural visitation. A Suffolk farmer and his family were staying in a room just off this landing. He was a large man, at least 6'4", certainly not of a nervous disposition, nor in possession of an overactive imagination. As his wife walked back into the room, she shivered as her husband appeared to be looking straight through her, transfixed as if focusing on a point just beyond her shoulder. He asked who the lady in the long grey dress behind her was, and as she turned to see what he was pointing at, the vision faded. She saw nothing. Knowing the man's down-to-earth temperament, she was as convinced as he was that there had indeed been a ghost following her, an eerie apparition that neither of them will ever forget. The most bizarre experiences reported within the castle walls have happened in this room built above a deep dungeon that can only be reached by this trapdoor. Known as an oubliette, it was not just prisoners thrown down into the depths. All manner of rubbish, including sewage and rotting animal carcasses, would join the unfortunate occupants, making death the inevitable outcome of incarceration. Definitely a revolting way to die. Perhaps the terrible, dark spiritual presence that seems to haunt this room belongs to a phantom prisoner still protesting at such barbaric treatment. One Christmas time, when work was being carried out on this part of the castle, 3 of the workmen were sleeping in this room. In the early hours of the morning, they were awoken by strange footsteps from the room above. Frozen with cold as the temperature had dropped to freezing despite efficient central heating, they watched as the door swung open, and all 3 felt that they were being pushed by invisible hands. A sense of desperation overwhelmed them, and when the strange mood lifted as quickly as it had descended, the men were very relieved and refused to pass another night in the room. A similar thing happened some months later when a schoolmaster was sleeping in the room with a party of youngsters. This time it was summer, but he awoke to strange noises and freezing temperatures, and when he tried to switch on the torch by his bedside, it wouldn't light. The incident was again a brief one, but the terrible pushing and claustrophobic atmosphere were dreadful. Thankfully, no one else was disturbed, but evidently a strange phenomenon was at work, a theory borne out on a number of occasions when certain visitors have felt so repelled by a malevolent spirit that they have refused to even enter the room. A past warden's dog that in every other respect was perfectly calm and sensible shared the same difficulty and would never cross this ghostly threshold. Whatever is really behind the wonderful stories connected with this ancient castle, St. Briavels truly is a mysterious place, and for those who dare, a night under its haunted roof will prove to be a memorable experience. This elegant country house set peacefully in the rural town of Berkeley can boast the presence of a very special ghost. The man who lived most of his adult life here and died within its tranquil walls in 1823 altered the course of history, improving the health of the entire world. Edward Jenner was an exceptional doctor at a time when medicine had a highly dubious reputation, but his tenacious determination to learn and apply scientific theory to the terrible diseases of the day made him a rare pioneering spirit in a profession where financial gain was usually the major motivation. Smallpox was a common condition that Jenner had to treat on a daily basis, although there was little he could do to alleviate such terrible suffering. Whether a patient would live or die was in the lap of the gods, and children were particularly vulnerable, a fact that constantly haunted Jenner. As a young surgeon's apprentice, Jenner had noticed that the local milkmaids never seemed to catch smallpox, although they did frequently contract cowpox, a much milder infection. He became convinced that it was the cowpox that afforded them the protection, but it would take him over 30 years to prove his theory and convince the medical experts that vaccination was a vital weapon in the war against the speckled monster. The Chantry, Jenner's beloved home, is now a museum, and visitors can see where he carried out his experiments. There are his drawings of the cowpox pustules belonging to Sarah Nelms, the milkmaid who provided the means for his first vaccination, and there's even a portrait of Blossom, the cow that infected her. Reported sightings of Edward Jenner's ghost are a regular occurrence, particularly when people walk into the house. It's as if the great man still likes to know what's going on, watching over the very private home that has become a public memorial. This rustic building in the Chantry's garden was dubbed the Temple of Vaccinia by Jenner, and if his spirit lingers anywhere, it's here. When Jenner first announced his cowpox findings, the doctors that had been inoculating with smallpox, charging very high prices for their services, did everything in their power to discredit him. The last thing they wanted was competition, especially from a technique that offered effective protection against smallpox with virtually no side effects. What was worse for them was the fact that Jenner was determined that vaccination should be available to all, whatever their financial circumstances. The little hut, with the grand name, was used for vaccinating the poor of the locality, which Jenner would undertake at least a few times a week. Edward Jenner was, without doubt, a driven man, obsessed with his scientific discoveries, almost to the point of fanaticism. If it had not been for his work with smallpox, Jenner would still have gone down in history as a great scientist. He trained in London with John Hunter, one of the most eminent surgeons of the 18th century, who became a mentor and a personal friend. Jenner's interest in natural history and his discovery of the cuckoo's antisocial nesting behaviour earned him Fellowship of the Royal Society, and with John Hunter's encouragement he undertook the study of hibernation in hedgehogs. Jenner had also made some dramatic discoveries regarding the human heart, and although he didn't publish his findings, he had realised that blocked arteries were the cause of angina. John Hunter had become ill with what Jenner recognised as angina, and his reluctance to publish may have been due to not wishing to upset his friend. However, Hunter was no fool, and when he claimed that his life was in the hands of any fool who cared to upset him, he was evidently aware of his condition. Hunter's prediction was confirmed when he died sometime later, having had a huge row with colleagues at St George's Hospital in London. The interesting question here has to be, how did Jenner find out about blocked arteries? Consider the medical climate of the time. The only way that students could learn about the function of the human body was by dissection. Stories of body snatching abounded, and great effort went into securing the corpses of interesting specimens. A country surgeon, treating patients over a wide area as Jenner did, had plenty of opportunity to observe medical conditions, and with the benefit of post-mortem could confirm his suspicions. For a sensitive man, as Jenner most definitely was, who can say how upsetting this may have been, particularly in the cases of those he knew well. Perhaps Jenner himself felt the presence of their departed souls, but his quest for knowledge would have made him immune to any fear of ghosts. Ironically, hearing strange voices was a phenomenon that Jenner had suffered since childhood as a result of smallpox. As a young boy, Jenner was not blessed with good fortune. Edward was an orphan before reaching his 6th birthday. His older brothers and sisters did the best they could for him, sending him away to school at the age of 8. It was here that Edward was deliberately infected with smallpox, the costly protection offered by the medics. For 6 weeks the little boy was starved, and when sufficiently weak was incarcerated with the other schoolboys in a stable where they were all infected with smallpox. The harrowing illness in such appalling conditions left Jenner constantly anxious and unable to sleep, as well as suffering auditory hallucinations. But Jenner was one of the lucky ones. Not only did he survive, he also retained his sight. Many smallpox victims became blind as a result of the illness. This explains why Jenner was so determined to do what he could to prevent the disease. He was ridiculed and dismissed by the medical establishment, and he paid a high personal price to make sure that vaccination was allowed to do its job. Jenner almost became bankrupt, and his own family saw little of him as he saved the lives of so many others. When he died in 1823, despite his great achievements, he was quietly buried here in the little church at Berkeley, a true genius unappreciated by his professional contemporaries. However, in 1980, the World Health Organization announced that smallpox had been eradicated, with homage paid to Jenner on a global scale. Edward Jenner's ghost, should he ever be encountered today, could introduce himself with great pride, at last able to claim his rightful place in medical history.
My name is Jenner, Dr. Edward Jenner, and I am the vaccine clerk to the world.